It was one of those quiet nights. The kind where everything feels ordinary, like the world outside our little apartment doesn't exist. Jake and I had been married for 4 years, and even though things weren't perfect, we had a routine, something that kept us going. We didn't fight often, but we were definitely in a bit of a rut. Conversations that used to flow easily had started to feel stiff. The little things that once amused us seemed less funny, less meaningful. Jake had been talking more about his job recently, about how he felt stagnant and unfulfilled. I listened, but I didn't quite understand. He had always been so passionate about his work, so driven when we first got married. Lately, it seemed like the fire had faded. He kept mentioning his dreams of changing careers, starting something new, but he felt trapped because he didn't have a college degree. He had dropped out years ago when he realized that the traditional path wasn't right for him. And yet, he still carried the weight of that decision with him every day. I had never taken it seriously. I thought it was just another one of Jake's many phases. He was always full of big ideas, but he never followed through. He was always the dreamer, while I was the practical one, the one who had a degree, a steady job, the safe path. We were a team, but I guess I had always been the one who pulled the strings. And I never realized how much that bothered him. That night, after dinner, we were talking about the future. I don't even remember how it started, but Jake began to talk about his plans again. He said he wanted to move into a more creative field, to work on something that didn't require a degree. His eyes lit up when he spoke about it, and for a moment, I saw the passion that had been missing for so long. But then I made the mistake. The joke just slipped out before I could stop it. Well, I guess it's a good thing you don't need a degree to do that. I mean, you didn't even finish college, right? I said, laughing lightly, like it was a harmless quip. Guess that's a bit of a disadvantage. Jake went silent. His smile faltered, and his gaze dropped to the table. I couldn't understand why. To me, it was just a joke. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I didn't even think he'd care. But the atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. The lightness I had expected hung in the air like a heavy weight. Jake didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me. For a moment, I was confused, unsure if I had crossed a line. And then I saw it, the hurt in his eyes. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up and walked into the other room without a word. I was left sitting there, my words echoing in my mind, trying to figure out what had just happened. I knew Jake. I knew when he was upset, but this was different. This was something deeper, something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. And I realized, too late, that my joke, my casual, thoughtless remark, had struck a nerve I didn't even know existed. He didn't come back to the table that night. Instead, we went to bed in silence, the tension hanging between us like an invisible wall. I lay there, wide awake, feeling a knot of unease in my stomach. I had no idea how one joke, one flippant comment, could make everything feel so fragile. And I didn't know that my words would set off a chain of events that neither of us was prepared for. The next few days were quiet, but in the way that makes you uneasy. The kind of quiet where you can feel the unspoken words hanging in the air, where every glance feels loaded with something you can't quite name. Jake had pulled away even further since that night. At first, I tried to brush it off, thought maybe he was just tired, maybe it was stress from work, or maybe he just needed some space. But the longer it went on, the more I realized that something had shifted, something I hadn't even noticed until it was too late. We used to talk about everything, small things, big things, all of it. Our conversations had been the glue that kept us close, even during the hard times. But now, there was silence. When I came home from work, Jake was always either in his office or staring blankly at the TV, not really watching. He didn't seem interested in anything anymore. Not the shows we used to binge watch together, not the plans we'd made for the future. It was like a part of him had gone missing. I tried to reach out. I'd ask him how his day went, if he wanted to go grab dinner or just do something to break the monotony. But his responses were always short, almost robotic. "Fine," he'd say, without looking at me. "I'm good, just tired." And that was it. There was no spark in his voice, no hint of interest. I started to wonder if I was just talking to a stranger, someone who was physically there but emotionally absent. I noticed that Jake had stopped doing little things he used to do for me. He never used to mind picking up groceries or making my favorite dinner after a rough day, but now even those small gestures seemed to have faded away. It was like he had checked out, mentally and emotionally, and I was too blind to see it coming. One night, after a long day at work, I decided to make his favorite pasta, hoping it might bring back some of the connection we had lost. I set the table, lit a candle, and tried to make the atmosphere as normal as possible. But when Jake came in, he barely acknowledged what I'd done. He sat down, picked at his food, and then, without warning, excused himself to the other room. I felt a pang of frustration mixed with confusion. Why was he shutting me out? What had happened to the man I married, the man who would stay up late talking with me, who would plan weekends away just to surprise me? Where had that person gone? The next day, I tried again. I walked into the office while Jake was working from home and sat on the edge of his desk. "Jake, talk to me." "What's going on?" I asked gently. He looked up from his computer, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought maybe he was going to open up, but instead, he just sighed and said, "It's nothing. I'm just tired, that's all." But I didn't believe him. I knew him too well to fall for that. Something had shifted inside him, and I couldn't figure out what it was. We weren't just tired. We weren't just going through a phase. There was a deeper distance growing between us, and I had no idea how to fix it. I spent the next few days in a haze, unsure of how to break through the wall that had appeared between us. Every time I tried to ask him what was wrong, he would give me the same answer, nothing. But I knew. I could feel it. He was pushing me away, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. It was a week after the incident, and things had only gotten worse. I woke up one morning to find Jake's side of the bed cold, empty. He had left early again without saying anything. I didn't even have to ask where he had gone, he was avoiding me, and it was becoming painfully obvious. At work, I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to Jake, replaying the moments when he'd pulled away. I kept asking myself what had gone wrong. Had I said something else? Had I made him feel small in a way I didn't understand? It was the silence between us that was the hardest to bear, the cold indifference that seemed to settle over everything we did. Even the most trivial things became unbearable. The way he didn't respond to my texts, the way he wouldn't make eye contact when we passed each other in the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. That evening, I decided to confront him. I couldn't stand living in this limbo any longer, where everything felt like it was falling apart and no one was willing to say a word. When I walked through the door after work, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, as though nothing had changed. He looked up briefly when I entered but quickly averted his gaze again. My heart sank. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk. What's going on with us? Why are you pulling away from me?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he sighed deeply, rubbing his face with both hands as though he was trying to avoid saying something painful. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. I froze, the words hitting me like a slap. "What do you mean I wouldn't understand?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Jake, I've been with you through everything. Why do you think I wouldn't understand?" He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. "Because you don't get it, all right? You don't get how much I've been struggling with everything. You think I'm just being lazy or unmotivated, but that's not it." I blinked, taken aback by the sudden outburst. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about my life," he spat, his voice rising with anger. About how I've been stuck in this dead-end job for years because I don't have a damn degree, about how I've been trying to prove myself to everyone, including you. And all you do is mock me, like it's a joke. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never realized how deeply my comment had wounded him. I had mocked him for not finishing school, something I thought was trivial, a part of his past that didn't matter anymore. But to him, it was everything. I felt the weight of my mistake, my carelessness, pressing down on me. The truth hit me like a freight train. I had hurt him, deeply, and now he was done. Jake, I didn't mean it like that, I said, my voice cracking. I was just joking. I never thought it would hurt you. I'm sorry, so sorry. But Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with a pain I had never seen before. It's not just that, Emma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about this for a while now. About us. About how we've drifted so far apart. I don't think I can do this anymore. The words sent a chill through my body. I felt like the room had closed in on me, like the air was too thick to breathe. You want a divorce, don't you? I whispered, barely able to speak. Jake didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at me with sad eyes, and in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just the joke. It wasn't just that comment. It was everything, the silence, the distance, the years of unspoken resentment that had built up between us. I don't know if I can fix this, he said, finally. I think we're too far gone. And in that moment, I realized that our marriage had reached its breaking point. The days following our conversation were a blur. Jake and I had avoided talking about what had been said, but the unspoken truth lingered in the air, suffocating everything else. We both knew what was coming, but neither of us had the strength to take the next step. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, and I couldn't escape the constant ache in my chest. It wasn't just that Jake wanted a divorce, it was that I had driven him to this point without even realizing it. The weight of my actions, my careless words, seemed unbearable. But more than that, I knew I couldn't keep holding on to something that was no longer there. That Friday night, Jake came home late. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for him to come in and say something, anything. But when he finally walked through the door, he didn't look at me. His eyes were tired, distant, as if he had already checked out mentally. He went straight to the kitchen, pulled out a beer from the fridge, and cracked it open without a word. I watched him, feeling that same knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I had been trying to find the right words for days, but nothing seemed adequate. How do you fix something that feels irreparable? How do you undo the damage when the person you love has already given up? After a long pause, I finally spoke. Jake, I think we both know what needs to happen. He didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his beer, his gaze focused on the bottle in his hand. Yeah, I think so too. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. I took a deep breath. I don't want this to end like this. But I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. We've drifted so far apart, and I don't think either of us knows how to fix it anymore. Jake finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. I know, he said, his voice soft. I don't think I've known how to fix it for a long time. I felt the tears welling up, but I forced them back. I'm sorry, Jake. I know I hurt you. And I wish I could take back everything I said that night, but I can't. I wish I had been more understanding, more patient. But I didn't know how to help you, and I made it worse. Jake shook his head slowly. It's not just that. It's everything. It's the way we've both stopped trying, the way we've both just settled. I don't think we're happy anymore, and I don't know how to change that. There was a painful honesty in his words, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was hearing the real Jake again. The man who had been buried beneath the silence, the frustration, the distance. The man I had fallen in love with. But I also knew he was right. We were no longer the couple we had once been, and I couldn't force us back into something we had outgrown. I stood up, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Maybe we both need space to figure things out. Maybe it's time for us to let go. Jake didn't say anything. He just nodded, his face solemn, and I knew that he had come to the same conclusion. This was the end of us, not because we didn't love each other anymore, but because we had lost ourselves along the way. That night, we didn't talk much. We both knew what needed to happen, and the silence between us felt like the final chapter in a story that had already been written. In the morning, we would make it official. But for now, all we could do was accept the inevitable. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't because I was happy to be leaving him, but because I knew that this was the only way we could both heal. It had been a month since Jake and I had made the decision to separate. I moved out of the house, found a small apartment on the edge of the city, and threw myself into work, trying to keep busy, trying not to think too much about everything we had lost. The pain was still there, but it was becoming more manageable, like a dull ache in the background of my life. I had started to rebuild, one small step at a time. The silence between us had finally turned into a quiet peace, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. Then, one evening, I received an unexpected message. It was from Jake. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart beating faster. My first instinct was to ignore it, to leave the past where it belonged. But something in the way the message was written made me hesitate. There was no urgency in it, no desperation, just a simple request, almost like a question that needed answering. So, I decided to meet him. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop, the same one we used to visit when we were first dating. It felt almost surreal to be sitting across from him again, especially after everything that had happened. He looked different, softer, more relaxed. The tension that had been in his face for so long seemed to have melted away. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me realize that he had been carrying his own weight of regret and doubt, just like I had. "How are you?" he asked, his voice low but sincere. "I'm okay," I said, offering a small smile. "I'm figuring things out." There was a long pause as we both sat there, unsure of how to start the conversation. Finally, Jake spoke again, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "And I realized something. I was so focused on my own pain, my own issues, that I never stopped to see how you were feeling. I never really saw you, Emma. Not the way I should have." His words hit me like a wave, washing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I had expected anger, bitterness, maybe even some regret. But this honesty, it was different. It was raw, vulnerable, and it made my heart ache all over again. "I should have been more patient with you," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have listened when you needed me. I should have been there for you, not just when it was convenient for me." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Jake, I didn't make it easy for you either," I admitted. "I made jokes, I didn't always understand what you were going through. I was selfish too." He reached across the table, taking my hand gently. "We both messed up," he said softly. "But I don't want to end things like this. I don't want to end us, not without knowing we tried everything." I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of his words settling in my chest. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected him to come to me with such openness, with a willingness to try again. But was it too late for us? Was it too late to undo the hurt we had caused each other? "I don't know if we can fix this," I whispered, my voice shaky. "But I'm willing to try, Jake. I'm willing to give us a second chance." And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, it never is after you've broken something so deeply. But maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what we had lost. one step at a time.